Welcome everybody to this RSS webinar discussing the paper is the Carli Index flawed, assessing the case for the new retail price index RPIJ. Interestingly, on the same day that the National Statisticians have just announced that the RPIJ will cease to be published from March next year. My name is Paul Smith. I'm the chair for this session. I'm Associate Professor in Official Statistics at the University of Southampton. In a previous life, I worked in the Office for National Statistics, connected with the methodology of price indices. We'd like to thank the sponsors of the webinar series, Quintiles, for giving us the opportunity to discuss this and a series of other papers. If you downloaded the slides already, then Peter, our presenter, will indicate when he moves along to the next one so that you can follow those or you can see them on the screen. The structure of today's webinar, first you should note that the sound from the meeting is being recorded and that will be made into a podcast which will be available from the RSS website and from YouTube. When eventually we get to the question stage, you will find that your line is already muted, and that in order to speak you need to unmute it by pressing *6, and then you have to wait until you hear that your line has been unmuted, and then you can ask a question. Please be aware that other people may be trying to ask a question at the same time. The other thing that you can do is to, if you look at the web interface, there's a Q&A button at the top, and if you click there, then you can also type a question into the Q&A interface. And when we start the discussion, I'll try to take one spoken question followed by one of the typed questions until we run out of time. At the end of the webinar, there's a poll at the top of the screen which will gather feedback. And the system stores your name and email in there, but actually we will only extract the anonymised responses, so please be encouraged to type something in there at the end, and I'll remind you about that. We'll have a presentation from Peter Levell, who's the author, and then we'll have a response from Andrew Baldwin, who's going to be our kick-off discussant today, and we'll follow that with a series of questions. The presentation and the response from the discussant should use about half the time available, and then we can go on with further questions. So let me introduce Peter Levell, who's an economics researcher at the Institute for Fiscal Studies and a part-time PhD student at University College London. In the IFS, he works on a diverse range of topics, including measurement of expenditure, taxation, and the distribution of inflation. And he's got research on several topics, but including consumer price inflation, hence the paper we have today. And our discussant a bit later on will be Andrew Baldwin, who's formerly worked at Statistics Canada, the equivalent of the ONS in the UK. So without me saying any more, let me hand over to Peter to kick off with his presentation of the paper.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul, and thank you for everyone for joining in and listening. So I'm going to start on slide 2 of my presentation by providing a little bit of background to this story, to the UK context. And that is that historically the UK's had two main measures of consumer price inflation. Those are the Consumer Prices Index, or CPI, and the Retail Prices Index, or RPI. And then in March 2013, the ONS started to publish a new inflation index in addition to these, which is called the RPIJ. And at the same time as that, the United Kingdom Statistics Authority announced they would no longer recognise the RPI as what it calls a national statistic. So presumably this means that UKSA discourages the use of the RPI for official purposes, but the RPI is still published for those people that need a consistent series, and it's still used for a variety of purposes, including the uprating of excise duties, as the inflation index for government bonds, and for the price caps of regulated industries, and so on. So to show you why, in fact, we have these different indices matters, on slide 3, I've plotted these different inflation measures over the period 2000 to 2016. So here on the blue line, we've got the CPI, the red line, the RPI, and the green line is the RPIJ. And what you see is that in the vast majority of years, the CPI is lower than the RPI, with a notable exception in 2009. And the RPIJ is a bit higher than the CPI, but it's always lower than the RPI by about half a percentage point. Now, to give you the idea of the magnitude of these differences, if you look over the whole period, the RPI increases by 55%, and that compares to 44% for the RPIJ and just 38% for the CPI. So you can see if you have benefits, for example, indexed to one or other of these indices, you're going to get a quite different result from if you use one index rather than the other. So what explains these differences? So now I'm on slide 4. So there are two primary differences when it comes in terms of the difference between the RPI and the CPI. The first of these is that the RPI covers a different basket of goods to the CPI, and a particularly important difference in that respect is that the RPI includes owner-occupied housing costs, while the CPI does not. The second key difference is what's known as the formula effect. This is that the RPI and CPI use different formulae, or what we call the elementary level. In particular, the RPI makes use of the Carli Index, which is not used in the CPI. So the RPIJ replaces the Carli Index with a Jevons Index, an index that is used in the CPI. And the reason for this is that there was a review into the UK's consumer price indices conducted by the very respected economist Owen Dewart in 2012, and that raised a number of concerns with the Carli Index as a measure of inflation, and that review led to both declassification of the RPI as a national statistic and to the creation of the new RPIJ. So I'm now on slide 5. In this paper, I revisited this decision and asked if the Carli Index was indeed a flawed measure of inflation. And I did this by going through the 3 different approaches that are used in the literature to select index numbers. These are firstly the test approach, which asks if the index satisfies common sense properties or does things that we might consider to be perverse. The second is the economic approach, which asks if the index comes close to approximating changes in the cost of living over time. And the third is the statistical approach, which asks if how well an index comes close to measuring some suitably defined average measure of prices change. Now, each of these approaches is essentially independent, and there is yet no real consensus on which of these should be used if their conclusions conflict with one another. Nonetheless, in the end, I found, like Dewart, that none of these approaches gave clear support for the use of the Carli Index, and that the test and economic approaches tended to favour the Jevons. Now, for reasons of time, I'm going to discuss the first 2 of these, and I'm not going to discuss the third statistical approach, although we can discuss that in questions if people would like. So before I go through the process of deciding how to select different index numbers, I'm going to start by giving a bit of background on basic concepts involved in this discussion. So starting with what I mean by the elementary level, which I illustrate on slide number 7. So the key idea here is that price indices are constructed in several stages. And I've got here the stages of the CPI, or the stages of the RPI are very similar. In the first stage, the ONS assembles price quotes for a whole load of individual products in what's called base and a current period, and then groups very, very similar products together and calculates within each of those groups what's called the elementary aggregate price. So in this stylized example, I've got them calculating the elementary aggregate price for red wine sold in particular types of shops, sold in a particular region, the southeast of England. At the second stage, for the item level, they'll take an average over the different elementary aggregate price indices, in this case for red wine, to get an item level index for red wine. And then you can combine that with an index for white wine to get a class level index for wine, and then further levels of aggregation will take you to the overall CPI. So I'm now on slide 8. Now, at most stages in this process, when the price indices are combined, the different elements are weighted according to their importance in consumers' budgets. For example, we might take into account the fact that consumers spend relatively more on red wine than they do on white wine, and so give red wine greater importance in the index. What distinguishes the elementary level of the index is at this level, the products we're dealing with are so specific and so detailed that the ONS doesn't have expenditure information with which to weight them. And so for this reason, elementary indices are going to have to be unweighted indices. So I list some of the options National Statistical Agency has at the elementary level on slide 9. So the first of these indices is one we've seen before, one I mentioned before, is the Carli Index. So this is just an unweighted, simple arithmetic average of what we call the price relatives, or the ratio of prices in the current and base period. An alternative is the Duto Index, which is a ratio of averages rather than an average of ratios of the prices. And the third is the Jevons Index, which is a geometric mean of price relatives. So we multiply them together and then we take the nth root. Now there are various mathematical relationships between these formulae, which I have discussed in my paper and have been discussed elsewhere. But the most important of these is that the Jevons is always going to be less than or equal to the Carli Index. And that's as a result of Jensen's inequality. So what can we say about which of these indices gives what you might call the right answer to the measure of inflation? So for this, we have to go through our different approaches, and I'm going to start on slide 11 with the test approach. So as we mentioned, under this approach, we ask if the index satisfies common sense properties or tests. And there's a long list of such tests, and the vast majority of them are satisfied by all our different indices, and so don't help us to discriminate between them. Two examples of those tests are firstly positivity, which just says that the price index needs to be greater than 0. The identity test, which says that if current and base period price vectors are the same, then the overall price index should register no inflation. And it can be readily verified that both the Carli and the Jevons satisfy, for example, both these properties. Now, the case against the Carli index from the perspective of the test approach is that it does, however, fail some important properties. And the most significant of these is time reversal, which I've got here on slide number 12. This states that if prices change from period 0 to period 1, and then fall back to their original level in a following period, then the change index should register no change. And while the Jevons and Duto indices will do that, they'll register no change when you do this to them, the Carli index will in fact always show an increase in prices in this case. And in this sense, the index is said to register an upward bias. Now, not everyone thinks that the failure of time reversal is that bad. However, in the paper I showed that the Carli index can register inflation in a situation similar to time reversal that looks particularly hard to justify. And I did this by slightly rewriting previous tests of what are called price bouncing, where you reorder price vectors. So the new test that I propose is similar to time reversal, but it's possible to show that it's independent from that property in the sense that an index can fail, or time reversal while satisfying this property, although the converse of that statement isn't true. But more generally, you can think of it as a particularly bad failure of time reversal. So this test asks what happens if we simply scramble the order of prices in the shops and then put them back in their original order. It's perhaps best to illustrate this with an example which I do on slide 13. So here we've got two shops, A and B, which I assume are selling an identical product. Now between period 0 and 1, prices in shop A increase by 25%, while they fall by 20% in shop B. Notice that in practice all that this means is that I've reordered the prices from period 0 to period 1. Now the Duto and the Jevons show no inflation when you do this, but the Carli shows an inflation rate of 2.5%. And then when you go from period 1 to period 2, I then reverse the order of prices again. And again, the Carli index shows inflation 2.5%, while the others show no change. And the changed Carli, which is just the product of the period 0 to 1 change and the period 1 to 2 change, is 5% over this period. And notice that happens even though from period 0 to period 2, there's absolutely no change in prices at all. So to summarize, the Carli fails the important time reversal test in the test approach, and as a result it also fails the revised price bouncing test. And it's the failures like these that actually underlay the recommendation of DWIT's review to end the use of the Carli index in the RPI. So I'm now on slide 15. So the remaining question is how serious the failure of the time reversal property is. So after all, even if the indices used at the elementary level are time reversible, then the indices used at subsequent levels of aggregation in both the RPI and the CPI are not in general time reversible. So fixing things at the elementary level doesn't actually fix the entire index in that respect. So while that's true, however, we can say that the overall index is going to be less sensitive to biases associated with time reversal than if we had used non-time reversible indices at the elementary level. So that's the test approach. So a second approach we can use to select an appropriate index number is the economic approach. So I'm now on slide 17. So under this approach, we ask if the index does a good job at measuring changes in what we call cost of living. So that's the expenditure, change in the expenditure required to give a constant level of net welfare, or in the language of economists, a constant level of utility. Or another way of phrasing that is asking how much extra income do we need to give consumers to fully compensate them for a price change they've experienced. So ideally, this approach would properly account for consumer substitution responses. So if consumers are willing to substitute to relatively cheaper goods in the face of uneven price rises, then other things equal, the change in the cost of living, measured change in the cost of living, should be lower. So I'm now on slide 18. So under the economic approach, there's going to be a potentially infinite number of different cost of living indices, which depend on the nature of consumer preferences over goods. So two possible cost of living indices are firstly the Levell index, which is a share-weighted, budget share-weighted average of price relatives, and a geometric Levell, which is a weighted geometric average of price relatives. So the first of these corresponds to what economists call the on-tier preferences. And if consumers have those sorts of preferences, then they don't engage in any form of what we might call substitution behavior. The latter corresponds to one where consumers adjust their spending to keep budget shares constant as prices change. So that means if prices of a good increase by 10%, then the quantity will fall by 10%. So economists call these Cobb-Douglas preferences. Now the question of which of these representations is more realistic can in principle be answered empirically. But in practice that's very difficult to do because you're dealing with very detailed level of choices, and in any case demand estimation is a very difficult business. But what you might say is that it's not unreasonable to suppose that there's some substitution going on at the elementary level within some elementary aggregates, because we're dealing with goods that are in practice very similar to another. We're not talking about substitution between, say, tea and coffee, but between different brands of coffee sold in a particular region. Now I'm on slide 19. So can we use this approach to choose between the Carli and the Jevons as we did with the test approach? So for example, could we think of the Carli Index as representing a cost of living index for consumers with the on-tier preferences? Or could we think of the Jevons as representing the cost of living index for consumers with constant share preferences? So a common view is that you can't. So I've got here a quotation from Dewar from his review of consumer price indices in the UK, where he writes that the economic approach cannot be applied at the elementary level unless price and quantity information are both available. So what he means is, without knowledge of budget shares, we can't know if the Carli approximates the weighted price relatives in the Levell, or that the Jevons approximates the geometric Levell. Each of these indices is going to be associated with unknown biases that could be up or down, and we wouldn't know. So the usual recommendation, therefore, is that we don't use the economic approach at the elementary level, and we resort to test or statistical approaches at this level instead. So, however, I didn't find that a very satisfying solution, and that's because it would be inconsistent to use the economic approach to make choices at later stages of aggregation, while using some other approach at the elementary level. So instead, we're going to need some sort of approach that will allow us to choose an appropriate index number without information on budget shares. So I'm now on slide 21. So the principle I suggest we use is the principle of maximum entropy. And this is used in analogous situations where probability distributions are unknown. So an example of where one might use this in a statistics setting is suppose we have a weighted die with a known number size where the probabilities of dice rolls are unknown. So what would we guess about the probability of each individual roll? What would be our initial guess of the probability of each individual roll? So one starting point for this problem is Laplace's principle of insufficient reason. So this states in this sort of situation you should set the probabilities to be equal unless you have some reason to do otherwise. So I'm now on slide 22. So the principle of maximum entropy combines this principle, Laplace's principle, with any additional information we do have to obtain the prior probability distribution. So one objective function that does achieve this is Shannon's entropy function, which is got here on slide 22. And that's an objective function that you can maximize subject to restrictions that any available knowledge you do have would impose on the problem. So in a dice rolling example, for example, we might condition on knowledge of the average roll. So this function is maximized when probabilities are uniform and completely equal, and it's minimized when the distribution is degenerate from one outcome. So one outcome is certain, and all others have zero probability. So I'm now on slide 23. So to adapt this approach to our problem, we need only know that budget shares have all the same properties as probabilities. In particular, they satisfy the Kolmogorov series of probability theory. And that means we can apply the principle of maximum entropy to select them in the same way we select probabilities. So maximizing this objective function, subject to the knowledge that budget shares must sum to 1, is going to give us uniform budget shares in both periods, in both current and base periods. And uniform budget shares in both periods means not only that we can argue that the Jevons is an appropriate attempt to approximate the geometric list pairs, but also that the geometric list pairs, which implies constant budget shares over time, is the appropriate target index. So I'm now on slide 24. So on slide 24, all I'm showing here is that if you impose additional restrictions on the choice of budget shares, and particularly you impose those restrictions implied by economic theory, that consumers should choose in a rational and consistent way, that doesn't affect this conclusion. So the entropy maximizing selection of budget shares will still be uniform. So now on slide 25, I'm going to sum up to reach a final judgment. So in the paper I discussed the third statistical approach in more detail, and in my view this approach doesn't clearly favour one index over another. So the Carli and Jevons both differ in terms of their bias and variance properties, and so their statistical performance is going to depend on the context in which they apply. It's going to be highly context dependent. You can't really make a general judgment. However, I find that the test approach favours the Jevons over the Carli, since the Carli favours the significant time reversal test. And in addition, I suggest that the principle of maximum entropy can be used to argue that the Jevons is both a satisfactory approximation to the geometric pairs, and the geometric pairs is the appropriate target index. So hence, in conclusion, I concur with the decision reached by Dima in his review, and with the decision of the Office of National Statistics, that the Carli Index does appear to have some flaws. So thank you very much. That's the end of my presentation, and I look forward to hearing your questions and comments, and to hearing from our discussant, Andrew Baldwin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. And without further ado then, let me introduce Andrew Baldwin, from former employee of Statistics Canada. Andrew, over to you.
Thank you very much, Paul. I would like to thank Judith Shorten and the Royal Statistical Society for asking me to participate in this webinar. I would also like to congratulate Peter Levell on an excellent paper. If he keeps on as he has begun, he has a brilliant future ahead of him. Peter's paper convincingly argues that the RPIJ is a better cost of living measure than the RPI. Just today, the national statistician announced that the RPIJ will cease publication as of March 2017, while the RPI will continue to be published. According to him, the RPIJ continues to share defects with the RPI, quote, including using a direct measure of house prices to estimate owner-occupiers' housing costs, unquote. I'm sure this dysfunctional ruling will come up later in the webinar. As Peter notes in evaluating the Carli formula against the Jevons formula and other elementary aggregate formulas, one can adopt a test approach, a statistical approach, or an economic approach. Peter has wisely favored the test approach, which most clearly favors the Jevons formula. Arguments for the Carli formula have been based on the statistical approach, as in Mark Courtney's work, or on the economic approach, as in my friend Bert Bach's work. However, they are of dubious validity, especially in the British context, since they assume a direct index and ignore the problems caused by index chaining. As the paper points out, the failure of the Carli formula to pass the time reversal test is very serious. It means that in an annually chained index like the RPI, its use can induce a strong upward bias. Peter's paper notes that the RPIJ does not satisfy the time reversal test at higher levels of aggregation. Instead, it uses the low formula. This does not mean the time reversal test is unimportant. Instead, it argues for the RPIJ to switch to a formula that does pass time reversal, as is done for the Swedish CPI, which uses the Walsh formula, or the US chain CPI, which uses the Tornquist formula. A better choice would be the Edgeworth formula, which Statistics Sweden initially considered before opting for Walsh. Unfortunately, the use of any formula that satisfies time reversal requires a long revision period. For example, the US chain CPI can be revised for up to 24 months. Peter notes that the Dutot index can be dominated by, quote, the Dutot index can be dominated by the price movement of a single good, if that good is much more expensive than others included in the calculations, unquote. This was why Statistics Canada switched from the Dutot formula to the Jevons formula in 1995 in the Canadian CPI. The ONS should seriously consider further reducing the use of the Dutot formula in its consumer price series, where prices can flip from zero to positive and back again. The Dutot formula is still the only choice, since neither the Carli or the Jevons formula. Where prices can flip from zero to positive and back again, the Dutot formula is still the only choice, since neither the Carli or the Jevons formula satisfy positivity tests. Arthur Barnett asked if a reform of chain linking for the RPI might not reduce the formula effect. As David Fenwick showed in a 1999 paper, January link month is a very poor choice of link period for the RPI. The holiday sales in the January base month cause the price relatives for all months of the year to show more variability than they otherwise would. A December link month would be much better, which could be achieved either by reducing the already exceptional timeliness of basket updating of the RPI, or by changing the reference year for the household budget survey to run from June to May rather than July to June. Ideally, the RPI should have an annual calendar year link rather than a monthly link. This is the best and cleanest way not only of reducing the formula effect, but of dealing with seasonal goods. I would like to conclude with a series of questions for Peter, and he can choose to answer those that interest him. First, would he favor a reform of the RPI, RPIJ, or the CPI that would see the use of the low formula replaced by the use of a formula that passed the time reversal test, such as the Walsh or the Edgeworth formula, reducing the upward substitution bias in the index? Second, would he favor a review of the use of the formula in the CPI, and more particularly the RPI-RPIJ series, with a view to replacing it with the Jevons formula? except in those cases where it was more appropriate. Does he view the do-till formula as only being more appropriate than the Jevons formula where prices can flip back and forth between positive and zero? Or are there other cases where he believes use of the do-till formula is more appropriate? Third, would he favor permitting the use of the Carli formula in consumer price indices in the context of PPS sampling, with price updating of the item weights every year that new samples were not drawn? Fourth, would he support a change in the link month for the RPIJ series from January to December to reduce the formula effect, or a change in the link period of the consumer price indices in general to link at the year rather than at any month? Fifth, does he see a need for a review of the outlier procedures or quality adjustment procedures used for consumer price indices in the UK, which arguably might help to reduce the formula effect? Sixth, would he favor the continued calculation of the RPIJ with publication of detailed series rather than just the aggregate? If the UK is to have a monthly household inflation index, should it be arrived at by incremental reforms to the RPIJ series? Thanks again to Peter for a stimulating paper and presentation.
So I think I might answer your last question first. So the fact that the subcomponents of the RPIJ aren't published. So in my other work at IFS, one of the things we look at is how the inflation rate differs between rich and poor households, between old and young households, and how different household spending patterns feed into those differences. And in order to calculate that, you need to have the subcomponents of the index, and I'm sure there's other purposes where you need to have the subcomponents of the index as well. So from my own personal perspective, I think it would be very useful if those things were published, particularly as people raise questions about the RPI and the CPI, since the CPI doesn't include owner-occupied housing costs. So your first question was, so given that the low index is used in the RPI and the CPI isn't time reversible, should you use more time or a time reversible index at upper levels of aggregation? So I think what this has in common with another set of questions is to sort of answer, should one make this change or should one make that change? The National Statistical Agency has to have in its head a kind of clear idea of where it wants to get to at the end. So from my own personal perspective, and perhaps this reflects my prejudices as an economist, I favour the economic approach. I think they should be trying to measure the cost of living, a cost of living index. That should be the appropriate goal, and I believe that is the goal of the Swedish National Statistical Agency and the Bureau of Labour Statistics. And so that should be the sort of guiding principle that allows people to should guide the statistical agencies making these sorts of choices. And in fact, I'd argue that, as others have done, that when it comes to other questions of how pricing is constructed, so for example, quality adjustment and so on, it really looks like economic justifications for these changes are being snuck in there in ways that you wouldn't be able to justify with, say, the test approach by ISL. So it does look to me like other people have that concept in their heads as well, whether they want to admit it or not. So in terms of the particular question, so should the low index be replaced by the Walsh index? So the Walsh index has a number of desirable properties as well as the fact it satisfies time reversal. And from the cost of living approach, from the economic approach, it's a superlative index. So like the Fisher and Formquist, it approximates change in cost of living for arbitrary preferences. So it has that going for it as well. So I think it is worth considering in line with another kind of broader, perhaps, well, a shift towards the goal price index.
Stop there.
Okay.
Otherwise, we don't want to monopolise all the time with Andrew's questions,
yes.
although they're interesting. Arthur Barnett did send in a question which Andrew referred to. He sent it in well in advance, and I shall just read that one out, and one that I now have on the screen, and then we'll give that back to Peter, and then it'll be open after that response for general spoken questions as well. So Arthur Barnett's question was about chain linking, and This question says, chain linking and price bounce are intimately linked, and the standard approach appears to avoid price bounce by selecting methodology for annual indices that's compatible with the chain linking algorithm. Why not change the chain linking so that it is compatible with whatever methodology you choose for the annual indices? So what's the rationale, the statistical or economic rationale for the use of the current chain linking algorithm? And I'm going to give you the first question of the typed ones that I have here, which is similar, which says, could the price bounce effect be measured empirically with real data by comparing chained and unchained versions of the RPI and the RPIJ?
Starting with Arthur's question. So this is a good question because it does get to the heart of the issue, which is the problems people have with the Carli Index from the perspective of the test approach is that they arise when you chain. If you didn't have to chain the index, you wouldn't have this problem. So rather than fixing the Carli Index, why not change the chaining algorithm so it's less sensitive to these sorts of issues? So I think the issues around chaining are is that the ONS has decided, and I'm not in a position to say if this is a good decision or not. I'm not in a position to question that decision. The index is going to be changed annually, and that allows them to update the basket of goods regularly, update the spending weights that are used regularly, and keeps the index relevant in a way that doesn't means you don't have to revise the index when you get new information. So last year's inflation doesn't get changed when you get new information this year. So I imagine that's why they use the chain linking algorithm they do. Given that you have that, then you do get this problem with the Carli and time reversal. Although, as Andrew mentioned, there may be ways to minimize that, like, for example, reconsidering the choice of base month and perhaps using this annual link rather than a monthly link. So the second question was, have people tried to measure the price bounce effect empirically? So when I use price bouncing, I mean in terms of this reordering of price vectors, which is a more sort of abstract test. The time reversal or chain drift problem where prices go up and down when the index registers an upward bias. I believe there are empirical estimates of that. There's a paper by Soch published a while ago that looked at this, but I don't have off the top of my head quantitative estimates of that. I don't know if Andrew has any thoughts on that.
Thanks, Peter. In the paper that I wrote on the Jevons formula, I noted that I did see a continuing rule for possibly for the Carli formula in the case of PPS sampling. If you had a new PPS sample chosen every year, then would really be no problem with of price bouncing or the failure to the time reversal test, since the sample would be updated every year. If you didn't, and you wanted to keep the same PPS sample for 3 or 4 years, you price update the weights from one year to the next, so that for the first year you would have a Carli Index. The second year it would be formally a weighted index with price updated weights. But in fact, it would be equivalent to your calculating a direct Carli Index over 3 or 4 years, however long you chose. You kept the same price sample, and you could get by the chaining problem that way.
One from Alan Rees. I should have said that the previous one was from Philip Turnbull. So this one from Alan Rees says, the paper discusses the merits of alternative formulae applied to the elementary data. Does Peter have a view on possible changes to the methods for collecting the elementary data? For example, do sample shoppers still go physically to shops, given that nowadays almost all prices are available on the web, and supermarkets themselves look constantly at rivals' prices? Similarly, does the lack of data on quantities still exist, given the huge amounts of data collected by vendors on shopping habits?
I see. So again, that's a good question. So it's true that data is becoming better and better. So we now have scanner data that gives us much more information on the expenditure shares people might be spending at different levels, even at the level of what are currently elementary aggregates. That could be exploited. You can also scrape prices from the web, and people do scrape prices from the web as a cheap and quite detailed way of collecting prices. I think the reason that they still do the survey, if you like, the old-fashioned way, is because not all shopping is on the web, and it's important to capture those prices that aren't listed on the web. Through a standard kind of survey. So I'm in general not as good on the practical questions of surveys and measurement, but I think that, yeah, there is definitely room for, or there would seem to be, that there's room for progress in those areas as new technology becomes available.
Yes, could I add something to that, please? My former supervisor, Bowden Schultz, was rightly skeptical about choosing the Carli formula to be consistent with an overall index calculated as a Lespère index, or the Jevons formula to be consistent with an overall index calculated as a geometric Lespère index. I think the reason for skepticism will doubtless increase as the use of scanner data and other detailed data pushes the use of expenditure weights further down the aggregation tree.
There, we'll ask Peter to go back to Andrew's original set of questions.
Sure. So, yeah, I'm not sure in which situations you get zero prices. So, for economists, nothing ever has a real price of zero. I mean, well, a difference between the Duto and the Jevons, so if you put the zero into the Jevons formula, you will get a price change of zero, whereas you, regardless of what's happened to the other prices, whereas you wouldn't with the Duto index. So that would be one reason to use the Duto for a pragmatic reason, to favor the Duto if the price had gone to zero. In general, as prices tend towards zero, it also means that the Jevons is going to be pulled down a lot, whereas the Duto is going to be less sensitive to that. And that could also give you a reason, except that if your approach is the economic approach, that's exactly what you want to happen. Because one price has fallen a lot, consumers are going to substitute a great deal to that good, so inflation is going to be very low, and the Jevons would correctly register that. So at the moment the Duto is used for pragmatic purposes instead of the Carli Index, because so the Carli might be dominated by a particularly large price change. The Duto is going to be dominated by a good that has a very high price, and it's used on that basis. But with all these choices, I would bring back to the fact you do need to have some overall idea of what the goal of this National Statistical Agency is when making these sorts of decisions. Okay, thank you.
Could I just say that Courtney's paper gave the example of the parking lot operated by municipality. As an example, there the municipality may decide to eliminate parking fees for parking at the municipally operated lot, and then it may change its mind back again and reinstate parking fees. So another case would be local transit fees for senior citizens. Again, the government may decide, municipal government may decide to eliminate those fees for senior citizens and then reinstitute them. Those kind of cases would be rare, but I think they could exist in.
I see what you mean, yes. So I think they would. Well, yeah, now you've given those examples, I can see that those sorts of things would exist in practice. And then the question is, So you need to sort of know that they're going to happen in advance of them happening if you're going to choose the index in that respect, looking forward to them happening. Otherwise, you'd have to change the index when the change came in. And in a way, I don't know if that's going to be preferable to, for example, dropping a good. But yeah, no, it's an interesting set of questions to think about. I'm not going to claim that I have all the answers.
I think there's an interesting question about whether you change the basket or whether you change the index.
Yes. Yeah.
Then I have another one from Philip Turnbull on the website, which says, Andrew mentioned using web or scanner data to help push down the use of weights to a lower level of price definition. I agree 100%. The more weights we have at a lower level, the smaller the formula effect matters, the less the formula effect matters.
Yes, so the size of the formula effect, or the difference between the Carli and the Jevons, it depends on the variance of price changes, and it's plausible that as you reduce the size of the groups, the definition of the groups you're looking at, that variance is going to shrink and the size of the formula effect is going to shrink. So what all efforts at reducing the size of the formula effect difference between the RPI and the CPI have in common is, unless you know kind of what the right answer is to start with, if you close that difference, or you find ways of closing that difference, that could lead you to have two wrong indices rather than one index. So I'm not sure. So that what you'd hope would happen is that the choice of what is an elementary aggregate is chosen through some sort of independent criteria, as well as kind of a practical issue of how low you can define them, rather than choosing the size of the elementary aggregates, for example, minimize the formula effect, which I'm sure it's not what Philip Turnbull is suggesting, but one could be led down that route.
Yes, Philip makes a very good point. It's a fascinating question, the best elementary aggregate formula, but any elementary aggregate formula is necessarily inferior to weighted index if you could find good and reliable weights, and that should be a focus of the efforts of the Office of National Statistics, I believe.
Alan Rees has made an interesting point. He says, isn't the psychology for most citizens that the more you change the methods, the less faith they have in the results, especially when it's used to index something that affects them, like taxes or benefits?
Yes, so no, I think yeah, that's a good point. So I think that's true. So on the one hand, you wouldn't necessarily want to stick to outdated methods that you thought were wrong as new methods come along. But every time you change the index, and particularly if you create a whole suite of different indices that different people can choose, you potentially create the problem that, or what they call inflation shopping, that the users of that index, or sophisticated users, might be able to choose an index that might suit their purposes, while it doesn't suit other parties, and by giving them this freedom, you've sort of made that problem worse. So ideally, yes, I mean, I think it would suit the UK to have fewer inflation measures, and you'd want the ones that remain to be using the methods that the ONS think to be the best ones. I don't know if Andrew has further thoughts on that point.
Yes, inflation shopping isn't a good idea, but I think there is definitely a need for at least two measures of inflation. One measure that would be appropriate to a central bank looking to control inflation, and another quite different measure of inflation that would be used for upgrading to a cost of living adjustments. The theory on this has been largely developed by British economists and statisticians, and I think it's sad now that the ONS seems to be gravitating more away from that, more towards, if I understand their position correctly, more towards using the CPI or the CPIH for both purposes.
A question just popped in from Jill Wayland, who's been trying to ask orally, but doesn't make any impact on the system, so we'll ask it for her. On our recent question, the Digital Economy Bill currently before Parliament should make it easier for ONS to acquire scanner data. This could make a big difference in time. The question is, Jevons is fairly robust to outliers, but it can be sensitive to very low numbers at the extreme, and the extreme cannot be used to zero. This may be okay if you assume consumer substitution, but this is not the case in fashion clothing where the majority of the formula effect arises. Sharp price falls are largely driven by discounting, in other words, reactions to customers not buying the goods. So doesn't Jevons tend to underestimate in this case?
For clothing. So I'm aware that there was a phenomenon where the formula effect did increase rapidly when the ONS changed its sampling procedure for clothing in a way that increased the variance of price relatives by being, I think, more discriminating in the choice of what is or is not a comparable item. Less discriminating in choosing what is a comparable item in a way that increased sample sizes, but also increased the variance of the price relatives. So, on the empirical question of sort of how much substitution there is in the clothing industry when it's a fashion item, so the idea of the kind of the problem with the elementary level is that you don't know empirically what the size of substitution effects are. So you could imagine, it doesn't seem implausible to me that if the good is heavily discounted, then people will be buying that good rather than other goods. And that would be the purpose of people discounting it. But in general, the sort of, if you like, the merit of the entropy approach to the when deciding what budget share should be at the elementary level and the economic approach is that if you do have additional information like that, you can incorporate that, or it provides a framework by which that could be incorporated. So you might think that Carli is more reasonable for some things than Jevons, for example. I don't know if Andrew wants to add something to that.
Yes, thanks. Raises a very good question. I just wanted to say one thing on that the site Rice in 2009 paper found that the Tukey method used to adjust for outliers in the UK consumer price indices performed very poorly as compared to use of the quartile method with log transformation of price relatives. I wonder if in some cases these big price decreases that she speaks about for clothing are retained in the index when they should either be discarded or adjusted for, and that this accounts for some of the problem in clothing, rather than reconsidering the use of the Jevons formula, that the ONS would reconsider their outlier procedures.
Let me do the closing bits. So I'd like to thank Peter and Andrew very much for their contributions, and to all of you on the line for your participation. A word also to Quintiles for sponsoring the event and giving us the opportunity to do this discussion. It's been very good.